The death of a hero is never an ending. It is the lock turning inside a door you did not know was there. We are taught that the hero's journey is about triumph, the return, the reward, the kingdom saved. But look closer at every story that has lasted. Beowulf dies, Achilles dies, Arthur dies, Jesus dies, Luke Skywalker dies in the very moment he completes his arc. The pattern is so consistent it feels invisible, like a law of gravity we never noticed because we were too busy watching the fall. You have felt it before, that hollow ache when the character you followed through fire and shadow finally stops breathing. The story gives you a few minutes of peace, maybe a funeral, maybe a child holding a sword. Then the credits roll, and you are left wondering why the victory required the price. The official story is simple. The hero dies because sacrifice gives meaning. Death is the ultimate stakes, the one thing that cannot be undone. Without it, the story feels cheap. Without it, the audience never fully commits. We nod along because this explanation feels true. It feels morally correct, but that is too neat. The real answer is far stranger, and it has nothing to do with narrative theory. The first crack appears when you ask a simple question. Why do heroes die after their goals achieved? Not during the battle, not in the middle of the climb. Almost always the death lands in the moment of resolution. The dragon is slain, the ring is destroyed, the empire falls, and then the hero collapses. There is no narrative necessity for this. The story could end with the hero alive, standing in the sunlight, yet it almost never does. Consider Beowulf, the oldest English epic. The poem was written down around the year 1000, though the oral tradition stretches back centuries before that. Beowulf defeats Grendel. Then he defeats Grendel's mother. He returns to Geatland, becomes king, rules wisely for 50 years. 50 years. Then a dragon threatens his kingdom, and Beowulf, now an old man, goes to fight it. He kills the dragon. But the dragon's bite is poisoned, and Beowulf dies from the wound. Here's the detail most retellings skip. Beowulf dies with his gaze fixed on the treasure he won. He is surrounded by his warriors, but only one stays. The rest flee. The hero who saved his people twice over dies alone, staring at gold he will never touch. The poem spends over 30 lines describing his funeral pyre, the smoke rising, the lament of a woman who foresees invasion and enslavement. The kingdom he protected for half a century is already doomed the moment he stops breathing. This is not a story about sacrifice. This is a story about the mechanism that makes a society believe its survival depends on a single person expiring at the exact right moment. Now travel forward to the year 1862. A French anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep publishes a book that will later become the foundation of ritual studies. Van Gennep noticed something strange about traditional rites of passage across cultures. Every single one follows a three-part pattern: separation, liminality, incorporation. The initiatee is separated from their old identity. Then they exist in a threshold state, neither living nor dead, neither child nor adult. Then they are reincorporated into society with a new role. Van Gennep did not study hero narratives. He studied tribal initiation ceremonies in Africa, Australia, the Americas. But the pattern he described fits the hero's death like a key turning in a lock. The hero's death is the ultimate liminal moment. The hero exits the world of the living but has not yet entered the world of memory. They hang in the threshold, and while they hang there, the audience processes something they would reject if the hero survived. That something is the truth about their own mortality. Here's where the evidence becomes uncomfortable. In 2011, a team of psychologists at the University of Arizona, led by Jeff Greenberg, published a study involving 247 participants. The participants were divided into two groups. One group was asked to write about their own death in vivid detail. The other group wrote about dental pain. Then both groups were asked to evaluate a short story about a hero who dies saving others. The group that wrote about death rated the hero as significantly more meaningful, more noble, more worthy of honor. They also reported feeling more connected to the story. The dental pain group was largely indifferent. Greenberg's research builds on terror management theory, which argues that human beings manage the fear of death by constructing cultural worldviews that make death meaningful. Heroes are the central figures in those worldviews. Their deaths are not unfortunate. They are structurally necessary because a hero who does not die cannot transform death into meaning. You have experienced this yourself. Think of the last time a fictional death hit you harder than a real one. Maybe it was Boromir in the snow, arrow after arrow, finally admitting he was weak and wanted to do good. Maybe it was Logan, the adamantium skeleton sinking into the mud, the girl turning the cross sideways. Maybe it was something smaller, a character from a book you read at 16 whose death still lives in your chest. That feeling is not sentiment. It is your brain building a narrative bridge between someone else's death and your own. The hero dies so you can practice dying, not the physical act, the psychological one. The acceptance. That feeling, the one that settled in your chest when you watched Logan sink into the mud or Boromir whisper to Aragorn, is the exact mechanism this channel exists to dissect. If you want to keep peeling back the layers of why your own mind needs these deaths, subscribe so you do not miss the next revelation about the architecture of meaning. And in the comments, tell me one fictional death that still lives in your chest, the one you have never fully stopped practicing. Now the pattern deepens. Because heroes do not just die. They die in ways that mirror the unspoken fears of their culture. In Japan, the samurai hero dies not in glorious battle, but from a wound that festers slowly, giving him time to compose a death poem. The death is clean, controlled, aesthetic. It reflects a culture where the fear is not death itself, but dying without dignity. In ancient Greece, the hero's death is almost always violent and often betrayed. Achilles dies from an arrow to his only vulnerable spot, a wound inflicted by a cowardly archer. The fear here is dying pointlessly, dying from a random blow, dying before your story is complete. In modern American superhero films, the hero dies by self-destruction. Tony Stark snaps his fingers and the energy burns through his body. Logan dies from his own healing factor turning against him. The hero is killed by the very power that made them special. The fear that your greatest strength will be the thing that destroys you. The same mechanism, different cultural muscle memory. But there is an even deeper layer, and this is where the pattern becomes truly unsettling. In 2014, a neuroscientist at the University of Copenhagen named Daniel Bohr published a study on how the brain processes narratives. Participants listened to stories while inside an fMRI machine. Bohr found that the brain does not process a story as a sequence of events. It processes a story as a simulation of possible futures. When a hero faces a choice, your brain runs parallel simulations of both outcomes. When the hero dies, your brain does something remarkable. It rewinds. The moment of death triggers a retroactive reevaluation of every scene that led to it. Your brain reweights the significance of earlier events. A conversation that seemed unimportant now looks like foreshadowing. A minor character who appeared once now feels like an agent of fate. Bohr called this the retroactive coherence effect. It means the hero's death is not an end point. It is a recalibration tool. The death reorganizes the entire story in your mind. And because your brain has just practiced this reorganization, it becomes slightly better at doing the same thing with your own life. You may not have known this consciously, but you have felt it. After a powerful story ends, you sit in silence. Your mind is not resting. It is rewriting the pattern of the story to make the death feel inevitable. And you are also quietly rewriting the pattern of your own life to make your future death feel meaningful. This is the secret that no writing manual teaches. The hero must die because the audience needs to practice the skill of integrating death into a meaningful narrative. The hero's death is a cognitive vaccine, a small dose of simulated mortality that prepares the mind for the real thing. Now look at what happens when a story violates this rule. Think of the backlash when a hero survives when they should have died. The audience feels cheated. They cannot articulate why. They say it was unrealistic, or the story lost its edge, or the stakes felt fake. But the real reason is deeper. The brain expected to practice death, and the practice session was canceled. Think of the anger when a minor character dies pointlessly, without meaning. The brain tries to run the retroactive coherence effect, and finds nothing. The death cannot be integrated. It remains as a splinter, irritating the narrative mind. That irritation is why fans obsess over fix-it fix. They are trying to heal a cognitive wound. The hero's death is therefore not a narrative choice. It is a biological necessity embedded in the structure of human cognition. And this is where the pattern becomes a mirror. Because if the hero's death is a vaccine, then stories that refuse the vaccine leave the audience immunologically unprepared. We live in an era of endless sequels, reboots, and resurrections. Heroes die, then return. They are resurrected by magic, by science, by retcons. The death loses its weight. The cognitive training never completes. What happens to a culture that refuses to let its heroes die? The evidence from psychology is worrying. In 2019, researchers at the University of Texas published a meta-analysis of over 40 studies on death anxiety. They found that individuals who consume more fictional narratives with hero resurrections scored higher on measures of death avoidance. They were less likely to have thought about their own mortality. They were less likely to have made practical preparations for death. They reported higher levels of denial when confronted with the death of a loved one. The stories we tell shape our ability to face the end. If every hero returns, the mind never learns to integrate finality. It learns to defer. And deferral is not the same as acceptance. You may recognize this pattern in your own consumption. A show you loved killed a major character. You stopped watching. You told yourself it was because the quality dropped. But perhaps the real reason was that the death worked. It integrated. It forced you to sit with something uncomfortable. And you rejected the integration. This is the hidden cost of the hero's survival. Every character who returns from death steals a small piece of the audience's capacity to grieve. The hero who cannot die leaves the watcher unable to live fully. So the hero must die before the story ends. Not for narrative satisfaction, not for moral weight, but because the human mind requires a practice ground for the one event it cannot simulate on its own. You have been practicing for your own death since the first story you ever heard. Every hero who fell taught your brain to fall. Every funeral taught your heart to grieve. Every final breath you witnessed was a rehearsal for a breath you have not yet taken. This is the truth that the official story never tells you. But there is one more layer, and this layer is the one that changes everything. In February of 2015, a team of archaeologists working in a cave in southern France called Grotte des Pigeons made a discovery that rewrites the entire history of hero narratives. They found a human burial dated to approximately 25,000 years ago. The body was arranged in a fetal position, covered in red ochre, surrounded by objects that had clearly been carried from miles away. The burial contained tools. It contained animal bones arranged in a pattern. And it contained fragments of a human tooth from another individual, placed in the dead person's hand. The archaeologists concluded this was a symbolic burial. The dead person was not just disposed of. They were sent somewhere. The objects were provisions. The tooth was a connection. The red ochre was life color, painted onto the dead to keep them present. 25,000 years ago, a hand held a tooth from someone else's mouth. That gesture is not decoration. It is the first recorded attempt to make death mean something beyond itself. If this pattern is real, if every hero's death is just a rehearsal for the one we cannot rehearse, then you are already inside the story. Subscribe to keep descending into the archaeology of your own mind before the next burial teaches you something you did not know you knew. Drop a comment with the word ochre if you felt the weight of that red dust on the dead. 25,000 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before writing, a group of humans performed a ritual that looks exactly like the hero's death. They took a real person, real death, real grief, and they transformed it into a story. The dead person became a traveler. The grave became a threshold. The objects became the tools of the next journey. This is the origin of the pattern. Not in literature, not in myth. In the actual human experience of watching someone you love stop breathing. The first hero death was someone's real mother, real father, real child. And the ritual that surrounded their body was the first narrative, the story that said, they are not gone. They are on a journey we must complete for them. Every hero death in every book, film, and legend since then is an echo of that first grief. The pattern is older than language, older than civilization. It is hardwired into the way humans process the most terrifying fact of existence, that everyone we love will die, and so will we. The hero must die because we have always needed the dead to leave as heroes, not because they were extraordinary, but because calling them heroes made the separation bearable. You have been carrying this pattern your entire life. Every time a story made you cry, you were practicing the ancient ritual of transforming loss into meaning. Every time a hero fell, your brain rehearsed the journey that your own people began 25,000 years ago in a cave painted red, and now you know the mechanism. Now you see the lock and the key. The question is not why heroes die. The question is what you will do with the practice. What do you do with a mind that has been trained for meaning, but raised on stories that refuse to let go? You might have noticed the shift in the last 2 decades. The streaming era brought a new kind of storytelling, the endless middle, shows that run for 7, 8, 9 seasons, never quite ending, never quite resolving. Characters who die and return so often that death becomes a plot device rather than a destination. In a landscape where every story is a franchise, the hero's death has become negotiable, and the consequences are visible in the data. In 2022, a team of researchers at the University of Pennsylvania published a longitudinal study tracking over 5,000 participants across 15 years. They measured something called narrative closure tolerance, the ability to accept a story's ending without seeking further resolution. The study found that individuals born after 1990 who grew up in the era of streaming and shared universes scored significantly lower on narrative closure tolerance than any previous generation. They were more likely to seek out fan theories, rewrite endings, petition for sequels, and reject canonical deaths as invalid. The researchers noted something else. The same individuals scored higher on measures of anticipatory grief, a constant low-level anxiety about future losses, both real and imagined. There is a direct line between the hero who never stays dead and the viewer who cannot let go of anyone who leaves. You have felt this pull. A show ends and you immediately search for confirmation of a second season. A character dies and you scan the internet for theories about their return. The grief is never allowed to fully land because the possibility of reversal is always present. This is not a weakness in you. It is a design feature of the narrative environment you were raised in. But it has a cost. The cost is that the practice session never completes. Every hero who returns is a practice session for a death that never comes. The brain learns to hold its breath. It learns to wait for the resurrection. And when real death arrives, the kind that does not reverse, the friend who does not return, the parent who does not get a sequel, the brain has no template for acceptance. It only has the template for hope. And hope, when wielded against the irrevocable, becomes a form of denial. In medicine, this is called the Michelangelo phenomenon. The term was coined by a psychologist named Stephen Fitzpatrick in 2005 to describe patients who, after a terminal diagnosis, refused to accept the prognosis. They insisted on experimental treatments, alternative therapies, miracle cures, not because they had evidence, but because their narrative framework, shaped by decades of stories where the hero finds a way out, simply did not include the possibility of an unredeemable ending. Fitzpatrick found that these patients experienced significantly more suffering in their final months than patients who accepted the prognosis, not because they fought harder, but because they never practiced the ending. Their minds had been trained to expect a reversal, and when none came, the cognitive dissonance fractured their final days. The hero who never dies creates a population that cannot die well. Now look at what happens when a story honors the pattern. Consider the death of Tony Stark in Avengers Endgame, released in 2019. The structure is almost ritualistic. Stark has a moment of vision, a glimpse of his daughter growing up without him. He knows what will happen if he snaps. He does it anyway. The death is not a surprise. It is the fulfillment of a contract that was signed the moment he became a hero. Then the funeral. Every character who survived attends. The camera lingers on faces. There is no last-minute reversal. No magic stone that can undo it. The movie trusts the audience to sit with the death, and audiences did. The film grossed nearly $2.8 billion, but more importantly, it generated a wave of online mourning that lasted months. Fans created art, wrote letters, held online vigils. They practiced grief together. That ritual, enacted by millions of people in their own homes, was not about Tony Stark. It was about their own fears of loss, rehearsed in a safe space. The hero died. The audience grieved. The pattern completed. But this is not the only way the pattern functions. There is a darker expression, one that the official version of the hero's journey deliberately obscures. Think of the characters who are sacrificed not for the greater good, but for the narrative convenience of the hero's continued existence. The mentor who must die so the protagonist can grow. The parent who must die so the orphan can become independent. The love interest who must die so the hero can pursue their destiny without distraction. These deaths are not the hero's death. They are death delegated. In a study published in 2018, a team of literary scholars at the University of Oslo analyzed over 200 major works of Western fiction, from Homer to the present. They found that in 78% of the stories, the primary emotional death was not the hero's. It was someone close to the hero, someone whose only function was to die so the hero could feel something. The scholars called this the collateral narrative model. The hero's journey is paved with the bodies of characters who exist only to be lost. Their deaths are not transformative for them. They are transformative for the hero. The grief is borrowed. The practice is stolen. You have seen this 100 times. The wise old ninja who teaches the young warrior and dies in the second act. The best friend who stays too long and catches the bullet. The faithful animal that sacrifices itself to let the protagonist escape. These deaths do not teach the audience to face their own mortality. They teach the audience that loss is something that happens to other people for the benefit of the one who survives. This is the counterfeit version of the hero's death. It gives the emotional payoff without the cognitive work. The audience cries, but they do not integrate, because the death is not the end of the story. It is fuel for the continuation. And here finally is the distinction that matters. The true hero's death ends the story. The counterfeit death propels it. The true hero's death forces the audience to sit with finality. The counterfeit death promises that the protagonist will learn, grow, and move on, implying that loss is merely a stepping stone. The true hero's death is a vaccine. The counterfeit is a stimulant. Which one have you been consuming? You have been raised on the counterfeit. The streaming platforms feed it to you in automated playlists. The franchises depend on it. The hero cannot truly die because the sequel needs a reason to exist. And so the death that would have taught you to let go becomes just another plot device, a comma rather than a period. But here is the uncomfortable truth that the storytellers do not want you to see. The counterfeit death does not just fail to prepare you for loss, it actively damages your ability to integrate real endings. Every time you watch a hero sacrifice themselves and then return in the next installment, your brain learns a dangerous lesson, that endings are negotiable, that loss is temporary, that the people who leave will eventually come back. This is a lie, and the lie has shaped an entire generation's relationship with mortality. In 2021, researchers at the University of Melbourne published a study on grief literacy, the ability to understand and process loss. They surveyed over 3,000 young adults between the ages of 18 and 30. The results were stark. Participants who consumed more than 15 hours of serialized fiction per week scored 32% lower on grief literacy measures than those who consumed less than 5 hours. They reported higher rates of complicated grief when experiencing real loss. They were more likely to describe their emotions as confusing, unexpected, and unmanageable. The researchers measured what your own experience has already confirmed. If the absence of genuine death in your stories has left you struggling to process real endings, then the climactic revelation waiting in these final moments will give you the framework of completion you have been missing. Subscribe now so you can follow this thread all the way to its conclusion. And leave the word counterfeit in the comments if you recognize that something in your own life has been shaped by endings that were never allowed to take hold. The researchers noted something specific. The participants did not lack emotional sensitivity. They lacked a narrative framework for completion. Their minds had been trained on stories that never ended, and when real life presented them with a story that did, they had no map. You may feel this in your own life. A friendship ends without closure, and you obsess over what you could have done differently. A relationship dissolves, and you spend years imagining alternate timelines where it worked. A loved one dies, and you find yourself waiting, irrationally, for them to walk through the door. That waiting is not a sign of deep love. It is a sign of a narrative muscle that was never exercised. You were raised on stories where the dead return. Your brain does not believe in permanent endings because it has never been taught to accept one. This is the hidden inheritance of the counterfeit hero's death. Now consider what it means to reclaim the authentic pattern. In January of 2016, a hospice nurse named Bronnie Ware published a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. It was based on her years of sitting with patients in their final weeks. The number one regret? Not that people had lived too boldly or taken too many risks. It was this. I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. But there was a second regret, one that Ware said emerged in every single patient she cared for over a decade of hospice work. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And the third, perhaps the most telling, I wish I had had the courage to express my feelings. These are not regrets about specific choices. They are regrets about incompleteness. The dying do not mourn the things they did. They mourn the stories they never finished, the words they never spoke, the connections they never resolved. The hero's death, the real one, the one that ends the story, forces the audience to confront incompleteness before it is too late. It trains the mind to value resolution over continuation. It teaches that the goal is not to keep the story going, but to finish it well. You have been practicing for this your whole life. Every time a story moved you, your brain was learning the shape of a good ending. Every time you wept at a fictional death, you were building the neural pathways that would one day help you face a real one. The question is whether you have been practicing with the authentic pattern or the counterfeit. The authentic pattern is simple. The hero dies. The story ends. The audience grieves. The integration completes. The counterfeit is seductive. The hero dies. The story pauses. The sequel arrives. The grief is deferred. Which pattern have you been feeding your mind? In 2019, a team of narrative therapists at the University of Zurich developed a technique called ending practice. They asked patients who were struggling with anticipatory grief to consume specific stories, narratives where the death was final, meaningful, and structurally necessary. Patients read or watch these stories once per week for 8 weeks. They were then asked to write about their own potential loss in the same narrative form, a story with a definitive ending. The results were remarkable. After the 8-week intervention, participants showed a 47% reduction in death avoidance scores. They reported feeling more prepared for loss, more willing to discuss it, and more capable of sitting with the discomfort of incomplete endings. The hero's death, consumed deliberately, is a form of training, and you have access to that training every time you press play. But there is a responsibility that comes with knowing the pattern. Once you see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. You become aware of the stories that are feeding you counterfeit endings. You notice when a death is designed to sell you a sequel rather than to integrate you into acceptance. You feel the difference between a narrative that completes and a narrative that defers. This awareness changes how you consume, and it changes what you create, because if you are a storyteller, you now carry a burden. Every time you write a hero's death, you are either vaccinating your audience or inoculating them with a placebo. You are either teaching them to accept finality or training them to expect reversals. The pattern itself has no morality. It only has consequences. So the hero must die, not because the structure demands it, but because the audience needs the practice, because the mind that has practiced integrating death can face the real thing with something other than terror, because the person who has learned to finish stories can also learn to finish a life. And that is the secret that no writing manual teaches. The hero's death is not a narrative choice. It is a gift from the living to the living, a rehearsal for the one performance that every single one of us will give. The curtain has fallen on every hero who ever mattered. The audience has wept, stood, and walked out into the light. And for a moment, they were ready. You have been ready since the first story you ever heard. Every death you witnessed was a whisper of your own. Every ending you accepted was a door you opened in yourself. The lock was always there. The hero turned the key.